The morning of Sandra
What do you think
Pelham's
you're
daughter's
doing?
wedding, 200
Told
guests
you I'd
arrived
dig
at
us
my
out of this
farm
rut.
to find the venue had received
Oh no,
exactly
the altar!
the kind of natural upgrade a working farm provides when nobody bothers to ask the farmer's permission first. I was sitting on my front porch in my work boots drinking black coffee when the first car turned down my driveway, and I did not move, and I did not hurry, and I did not apologize for a single thing they were about to walk into. My name is Colt Weston. I am 49 years old, a third-generation farmer operating 212 acres of working agricultural land in central Tennessee, and I have lived on this property my entire life. My grandfather broke this ground in 1951. My father expanded it in the 70s and built the barn that sits 200 yards from my front porch, a post and beam structure with a standing seam metal roof and doors wide enough to drive a combine through. The barn has stored hay, housed livestock, sheltered equipment through 40 years of Tennessee weather, and smelled exactly like what it is for every one of those years, which is to say it has smelled like a working farm, which is to say it has smelled like animals and grain and diesel, and the particular richness of soil that has been productive for 7 decades. 4 years ago, the county approved a residential development on the land that had been the Garvey family's soybean operation to my north. The development was called Meadowbrook Estates, 81 homes on what had been 400 acres of cropland, with a homeowners association, a clubhouse, a retention pond they called a lake, and a set of CC and RS that governed everything from fence heights to holiday decorations. The development was built over 2 years and filled up steadily with people who had wanted a semi-rural lifestyle and had purchased it in the form of a subdivision lot with a view of fields they did not own and would never work. Most of my new neighbors were fine, genuinely fine, the kind of people who minded their business and occasionally waved from the road and once in a while stopped to ask what I was planting or whether the weather was going to hold. I had no quarrel with most of the people in Meadowbrook Estates. Sandra Pelham was the HOA president, and she was not most people. She was 62, a retired event planner from Nashville who had moved to Meadowbrook Estates with her husband Gerald and an organizing energy that had nowhere to go after retirement except outward into her immediate surroundings. She had the particular quality of certain event planners, the quality of seeing every space as a potential venue and every occasion as a production opportunity and every person in her vicinity as either a resource or an obstacle. She had been HOA president for 2 years and had spent those 2 years transforming the community clubhouse, commissioning a landscaping redesign of the common areas, and developing what she described at every opportunity as a vision for Meadowbrook Estates as a premier community in the region. She had also developed a vision for my farm. The first indication came 8 months before the wedding. Sandra knocked on my front door on a Saturday morning and introduced herself with the warmth of someone who had been trained in first impressions and practiced them regularly. She said she had been admiring my property and particularly my barn, and she wanted to discuss a potential opportunity that she believed could benefit both of us. She said she was organizing an HOA community event for the following spring, and she thought my barn and the surrounding pasture would make a beautiful setting. I told her the barn was a working agricultural structure and not available for events. She said she understood that, and she wanted to discuss compensation that would make it worth my while. I told her there was no compensation figure that would make it worth my while because making a working barn available for a catered event required days of preparation, removal of equipment, deep cleaning of a space that was functionally a livestock area, liability management, and a recovery period after the event that would cost me operational time I could not get back. She said she appreciated my perspective and she hoped I would think about it. I said there was nothing to think about. She left, I went back to my morning. She came back 3 weeks later with a different approach. This time she brought a folder with printed photographs of barn wedding venues she had found online, beautiful renovated structures with string lights and flower arrangements and guests in formal wear standing on surfaces that had been cleaned and sealed and finished to a standard that had nothing in common with the interior of a working barn. She said she could handle all of the preparation and cleanup herself and her committee, and I would not need to do anything. I said, Sandra, I appreciate the effort you have put into this, but the answer is no. This farm is my livelihood and my family's legacy, and it is not a venue. She said, I hear you saying that, Colt, but I wonder if you have really thought about the possibilities here. I said I have. The answer is no. She left again. I noted the date and the substance of the conversation in my farm journal, which I keep for operational records and which I have maintained daily for 19 years. I noted it not because I thought it would become relevant, but because noting things is a habit that costs nothing and has saved me more than once. Over the following months, Sandra found other ways to raise the topic. At the County Road Commission meeting where we were both present, she mentioned to two other attendees that she was hopping to work with a local farmer on a venue project. At the hardware store in town, she told the man behind the counter, while I was standing 3 feet away selecting fence staples, that Meadowbrook Estates was developing an exciting partnership with an agricultural property in the area. At a neighborhood gathering that the development organized along the shared road frontage, which I attended briefly out of courtesy, she introduced me to 3 couples as her farming neighbor who was considering opening his property to community events. Each time I corrected the characterization quietly and directly. Each time she received the correction with a smile that suggested she was treating my position as a negotiating posture rather than a settled decision. I documented each incident in my farm journal. 8 weeks before the wedding, I became aware of what was actually happening through a source I had not anticipated. My farm hand, a man named Burl Caston, who had worked with me for 11 years and whose cousin happened to live in Meadowbrook Estates, came to me on a Monday morning and said, Colt, I heard something at the weekend and I think you need to know about it. Burl told me that Sandra Pelham had been telling people in the development that the spring wedding, her daughter Cassidy's wedding, was going to be held at a local farm venue she had arranged. She had shown guests the printed invitation, which described the location as a private farm estate in central Tennessee and included a photograph, not of a stock image, but of my barn. My actual barn, my post and beam structure with the standing seam metal roof, photographed from the road. She had used a photograph of my barn on a wedding invitation for an event she did not have my permission to hold. I sat with that information for a full minute. Then I called Conrad Hess, who was not only Eldon Marsh's attorney but mine as well, having handled 2 property boundary matters for my family over the years. I told him what Burl had told me. Conrad said, Do you have a copy of the invitation? I said I would get one. Burl's cousin photographed the invitation and sent me the image that afternoon. It was a formal printed card, heavy stock, the kind that costs real money to produce. At the top it said the marriage of Cassidy Ann Pelham and Robert David Fitch. In the middle it listed the date, a Saturday in late May. At the bottom it said the ceremony and reception would be held at a private farm estate, followed by my road address. And on the back panel was a full-color photograph of my barn in morning light, taken from the public road, with the pasture visible behind it. I sent the photograph to Conrad. He called me back within the hour. He said, She has used your property address and a photograph of your structure on formal printed invitations distributed to what I assume is a significant guest list, implying a permission and a venue arrangement that does not exist. This is misrepresentation and potentially actionable on several grounds. How do you want to handle it? I said, I want to send her a formal notice today, and I want it to be absolutely clear. Conrad's letter went to Sandra Pelham by certified mail and by hand delivery to her front door that same evening. It was direct and complete. It documented the 2 conversations in which I had explicitly declined her requests, the subsequent incidents in which she had misrepresented the status of our arrangement to others, and the distribution of formal printed invitations using my property address and a photograph of my structure without my knowledge or consent. It stated that I had not granted and would not grant permission for any event on my property on the named date or any other date. It noted that proceeding with an event on my property without permission would constitute trespass, that any guests who arrived on my property based on the invitation's representation would be similarly trespassing, and that I reserved all legal remedies, including immediate law enforcement involvement and civil damages. It demanded that she contact all invited guests immediately to inform them that the venue had changed and that my property was not available, and that she provide Conrad with written confirmation that this notification had been sent within 5 business days. Sandra called me the evening the letter arrived. She was not using the warm event planner voice. She was using a voice I had not heard from her before, a clipped, controlled voice that was trying very hard to stay composed. She said, "Colt, this letter is completely unnecessary and frankly insulting after the relationship we have been building." I said, "Sandra, we have not been building a relationship. You have been making plans without my agreement and representing those plans to others as arrangements. Those are different things." She said, "I have 200 guests invited to this wedding. The invitations have been sent. The caterer is contracted. The florist is contracted. Do you understand what you are asking me to do?" I said, "I understand exactly what you are asking me to do, which is accept an event on my property that I never agreed to because you made commitments to others on my behalf without my knowledge. The answer is still no." She said, "I will make it worth your while, anything you want." I said, "Have all guests notified of the venue change within 5 days and provide written confirmation to my attorney." She said, "There is no other venue available on this date. Everything is booked through summer." I said, "That is a consequence of the choices you made, not a claim on my property." She said, "You are going to ruin my daughter's wedding." I said, "I am declining to host an event I never agreed to host. Those are different things. Good night." I ended the call. The 5-day window passed. No written confirmation arrived at Conrad's office. Conrad sent a follow-up letter on day 6. No response. Conrad called the HOA management company to put them on formal notice that the HOA president was engaged in conduct that could expose the association to liability. The HOA management company called Sandra. Sandra told them it was a personal matter unrelated to her role as HOA president. The HOA management company sent that exchange to Conrad in writing, apparently wanting to document that they had been notified. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received a call from the caterer, a woman named Patricia Dunn who ran a catering company out of the county seat. She said she had a contract for a 200-person wedding at my address, and she needed to discuss logistics. I told her directly that there was no event scheduled at my property, that her client had not had my permission when she contracted with her, and that she should contact her client immediately to discuss the situation and protect her own interests. Patricia Dunn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She told me the venue was confirmed." I said, "I know what she told you. It was not accurate. I am sorry you are in this position. It is not a position I put you in." Patricia Dunn called Sandra. I know this because Patricia called me back an hour later and said Sandra had told her everything was fine and would be resolved before the event and to proceed with preparations. Patricia said she was not comfortable with that and was sending Sandra formal notice that she was suspending preparations pending written confirmation of venue authorization. She asked if I could provide a written statement that I had not authorized the venue. I provided it within the hour. Conrad prepared it, and I signed it, and Patricia had it by end of day. The florist called the next day. Same situation, same conversation, same outcome. The florist suspended her preparations and requested a refund of the deposit from Sandra. Sandra called me after the florist call. She was not composed anymore. She said, "You are destroying this deliberately." I said, "I am telling the truth to people who are asking me direct questions about whether I have authorized an event on my property. I have not. Telling them that is not destruction. It is accuracy." She said, "My daughter has done nothing to you." I said, "Your daughter has done nothing wrong. You made choices that put your daughter's wedding in this position, and those choices were yours alone." She hung up. 1 week before the wedding, Sandra appeared at my front door at 7 in the morning. Gerald was with her, her husband. a quiet man who had said perhaps 40 words to me in 4 years, and who stood slightly behind his wife on my porch, with the expression of a man who had been present for a great many of Sandra's campaigns and had long ago made his peace with the role of witness. Sandra said she wanted to come to an agreement. She said she was prepared to offer me $5,000 for one day's use of the barn and the surrounding pasture, with her team handling all preparation and cleanup. I said, Sandra, the answer has been no since the first conversation 8 months ago. It was no when you put my address on the invitations. It is no now. A higher number does not change the answer. She said 3 days ago the venue I finally found fell through. There is nowhere else. 200 people are coming to this wedding. I said, I understand that is a serious situation. It is not my situation. Gerald spoke for the first time. He said quietly, is there truly nothing? I looked at him. I said, Gerald, I am sorry for what your family is going through this week. I mean that genuinely. But your wife made commitments on my property without my agreement and has spent 8 months representing to others that an arrangement existed which did not. I cannot reward that with a yes. Gerald nodded once. He took Sandra's arm gently and they left. I watched them go and felt the specific weight of a situation where the right thing and the easy thing were not the same thing, and you had to choose one. I chose the right thing. I had chosen it 8 months ago, and I was still choosing it. The morning of the wedding, I was up at 4:30 as usual. I fed the cattle. I ran the tractor through the north field for 2 hours on a drainage project I had been working on. I spread the load of composted manure I had been holding in the south pasture, which was adjacent to the barn, because I had a scheduling reason to do it that week, and I had not changed my schedule for anyone. By the time the first wedding guest car turned down my driveway at 10:15, I was back on my porch with my coffee, and the farm smelled exactly like a working farm in May, which is to say it smelled powerfully and completely like agriculture. I watched the first car slow as it came up the drive. It stopped about 30 yards from the barn. The passenger window went down. I could see a woman in a formal dress looking at the cattle in the adjacent pasture, and then looking at the manure spreader I had parked near the barn, and then looking at me on the porch. I raised my coffee cup. The car sat there for a long moment. Then it backed slowly down the driveway and turned around and left. The second car arrived 12 minutes later with the same result. The third car had 4 people in it, and they got out and stood in my driveway looking at the barn and the pasture and the cattle and smelling what May on a working farm smells like. And then one of them made a phone call, and they stood there for 5 minutes before getting back in the car and driving away. By 11 o'clock, 9 cars had come down my driveway and all 9 had left. My phone had 3 missed calls from an unknown number. I did not answer them. Burl arrived for his regular morning shift at 11:30 and took in the scene from his truck window before getting out. He said, "Looks like you had some visitors." I said, "Seemed like they were looking for something that wasn't here." He shook his head slowly and went to start his work. Conrad called me that afternoon. He said, "I received a call from Sandra Pelham's personal attorney this morning, a man named Douglas Fitch, who I believe is the father of the groom." I said, "What did he want?" Conrad said he wanted to know if there was any possibility of a last-minute accommodation. I told him there was not, and that the situation had been clearly communicated to his client on multiple occasions over 8 months, including 2 formal legal notices. I said, "What else?" Conrad said he also indicated that Sandra is planning to pursue a claim against you for intentional interference with a family event. I told him that any such claim would be defended vigorously and would likely generate counterclaims that I did not think he would find comfortable to litigate. I said, "What did he say?" Conrad said he said he would convey my position to Sandra. We did not hear from Douglas Fitch again. The wedding happened, eventually, in the Meadowbrook Estates clubhouse. I know this because Burl's cousin attended as a guest and told Burl, who told me. The clubhouse held 90 people comfortably, and there were 200 guests. The caterer Patricia Dunn declined to participate because her contract specified the farm venue. Sandra's daughter Cassidy and her husband Robert stood in a space designed for HOA committee meetings and ate food that Sandra had arranged hastily through a local restaurant that could accommodate a last-minute order. I heard it was a difficult day. I felt something about that, not satisfaction at Cassidy's difficult day, because Cassidy had done nothing wrong and deserved a good wedding. What I felt was the particular weight of watching a consequence arrive that had been avoidable at every point along the 8-month path that led to it. Avoidable if Sandra had taken my first no for an answer. Avoidable if she had not put my address on 200 printed invitations. Avoidable if she had notified guests when Conrad's letter arrived. Avoidable at a dozen moments between August and May, when the honest thing and the practical thing were the same thing, and she had chosen neither. Conrad filed the civil claim 2 weeks after the wedding. It covered the unauthorized use of my property address on formal printed materials distributed to 200 people, the misrepresentation of an agreed venue arrangement to vendors and guests, the reputational implication that my property was a commercial venue, which created inquiries and assumptions I had to correct at my own time and expense, the 2 formal legal responses I had been required to generate, and the operational disruption on the morning of the event, when 9 vehicles came down my working farm driveway during active morning operations. Sandra's response through Douglas Fitch was that she had done nothing wrong because the event had not actually taken place on my property, and therefore I had suffered no damages. Conrad's reply was that the misrepresentation had taken place regardless of whether the event had. That the distribution of materials bearing my address and a photograph of my structure to 200 people without my consent was an actionable harm independent of the event outcome, and that the operational disruption on the morning of the wedding was documented in my farm journal with timestamps and was real and compensable. The HOA board removed Sandra as president 6 weeks after the wedding. Mabel Fontaine was not on this board, but the mechanism was similar. 3 board members who had become uncomfortable with Sandra's conduct over her tenure used the wedding situation as the moment to formalize that discomfort. The vote was 5-2. Sandra sent a community email disputing the removal and citing her contributions to the community. The board did not respond to the email publicly. Settlement negotiations ran 3 weeks. The final number was $22,000, which covered legal fees, the documented operational disruption, and compensatory damages for the unauthorized commercial misrepresentation of my property. Sandra paid it from personal funds. There was no insurance coverage, because homeowners' policies do not generally cover the consequences of distributing formal printed materials bearing your neighbor's address to 200 people without authorization. Conrad called me when the transfer cleared. He said, $22,000. She paid it personally. I said, good. He said, Douglas Fitch called me after the settlement to say Sandra genuinely did not believe she was doing anything wrong. He said she thought your resistance was a negotiating position, and that once the event was far enough along you would accommodate it. I said she thought if she made the situation complicated enough, I would give in to make it simple. Conrad said, that is exactly right. I said people try that with farms sometimes. They think because the land is big and the work is physical that the person doing it is easier to move than a person in an office. They are usually wrong about that. Conrad said, $22,000 worth of wrong in this case. I said, yes. My barn is standing exactly as it has stood for 40 years. The post and beam structure my father built is weathered correctly for its age, maintained for its function, and smelling precisely like what it is. On a May morning with the cattle in the south pasture and the fields turning green and the standing seam roof catching the early light it is, I will acknowledge, a beautiful thing to look at. I understand why Sandra looked at it and saw a venue. But it is not a venue, it is a farm. It has been a farm for 70 years and will be a farm for as long as someone in my family is willing to do the work of keeping it that way. The work is the point. The smell is part of the work. The schedule is part of the work. The fact that I spread composted manure in the south pasture on the third Saturday in May because that is when it needed to be done is part of the work. Sandra had looked at my farm and seen a backdrop. I had spent my life looking at it and seeing something that required everything I had to maintain. The difference between those two ways of seeing is the difference between a venue and a farm, and no amount of string lights or floral arrangements or 200 guests in formal wear was going to change which one it actually was. Colt Weston walked back inside his house, put his coffee cup in the sink, and went back out to finish the drainage work in the north field. The farm needed it. The farm always needed something. That was the whole point.